All right, everyone, we'll get the webinar started. This is Lad Keith, Assistant Professor at the University of Arizona, and this is part of our webinar series for the Extreme Heat Network, which is a community of research and practice around extreme heat. And so we've had speakers talk about heat health, urban heat island mapping, kind of planning for extreme heat in different places. And today we're really happy to have Jeremy Hoffman join us from the Science Museum of Virginia. And he is going to discuss community-based participatory research campaigns to build climate resilience and talk about some of his work with citizen science and urban heat island mapping. Next slide, Jeremy. And just a couple of quick logistics before I turn it over to Jeremy. We just want to remind people to keep your webcams and microphones turned off so that we can hear Jeremy without feedback. And as always, after his presentation, we'll do a questions and answers. And to do that, if you could use the chat box function of Zoom, and you can open that by pressing Alt-H on your computer, or you can just kind of scroll down to the bottom of the screen and type in your questions using the chat box. So that's usually the easiest way to get those questions across to the speaker. And we are recording this presentation, and we will post it on the Extreme Heat Network YouTube channel afterwards for everyone to take a look at. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jeremy Hoffman. So thank you for joining us today, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you, Lad. And I'm excited to know that this will be on YouTube. I'm typically only featured on YouTube in really poorly done comedy renditions of famous music videos. So that'll be really unique for me. I'm really excited to be here today sharing some of the work that we've been doing with community-based participatory research campaigns, or what Lad referred to as citizen science. Goes by a couple different names, and I think overall the community is the community of practice is really starting to struggle with that idea of citizen science because of its potential limiting descriptor ability for certain members of our communities, and in the search to be inclusive, we're really struggling with how to make it the most inclusive. So I'll be referring to it kind of interchangeably as community or citizen science, and I'm trying to train myself to keep it or a little bit more focused on community. But in any case, I'm the chief scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia in Richmond, Virginia, and also an affiliate faculty in the Center for Environmental Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University. If you're interested in following me along on Twitter, I'm very active in that space, mostly about science, but sometimes memes and it's other random, hopefully funny things. And I have to acknowledge, like up top here, that a lot of this work could not have been possible without a lot of other amazing people, some of whom I will be talking about in this presentation. But by and large, as many of you know, good, effective community research is not possible without a lot of different collaborators. So I'm certainly always happy to celebrate them when I can. And so to give you a little bit of background, the Science Museum of Virginia was funded in 2015 to do some climate-related communication work for our guests in both like content, educational content, media, and exhibits. And really our interest in eventually what would turn into our community science campaigns started as a need to localize the impacts of climate change. And the state of Virginia, because I think maybe a lot of you are from the west coast of North America or in the west, southwest, the state of Virginia, Commonwealth of Virginia, is located kind of right on the border between the National Climate Assessment Northeast region and is listed in the southeast region of the North National Climate Assessment. And now we all like to say that we're in the mid-Atlantic because I think we have somewhat different regional climate trends than the far northeast or the deep southeast, where there could be even like muted temperature trends that we don't see going on locally in Virginia. And to much to the dismay sometimes, but actually kind of in the celebration of the authors of this report, I've distilled the major conclusions of these two chapters of the National Climate Assessment into 5 emojis. We need to be preparing for a hotter, wetter, sneezier, and wheezier Virginia. Now, today we'll talk a lot about the hotter stuff, but the wetter sense, you know, this coastal Virginia is being slowly inundated from rising sea levels and subsidizing coastal subsidence. So we're getting wetter in the sense of sunny day flooding is becoming more and more common, but also our precipitation events are more extreme than they were before, and that our heaviest precipitation events have gotten measurably heavier and are predicted to continue that way into the future. The sneezier emoji is one of my favorites and is related to our strengthening and lengthening allergy seasons, but partially due to a decrease in our average frost season. And then the wheezier Virginia, we're seeing going on right now for the last several years, wildfires in California significantly impacting regional and local air quality there. Also here in the mid-Atlantic, about 5 years ago, 2015, a wildfire in Saskatchewan, Canada, the smoke of which was brought aloft and then subsided over the Baltimore region, caused exceedance days for both particulate matter and ozone that they hadn't seen in a long time. So this to say that a wheezier Virginia might be brought on by large, far afield wildfires being carried in regional weather systems, or even localized wildfire, or a reversal in emission standards that would continue to release particulate matter and the precursors of ozone. So anyway, that's just a short story about what the future of Virginia could look like and the kind of climate that we should be preparing for. But we're here to talk about heat. So a lot of you are familiar with the fact that the frequency, duration, season, and intensity of our heat waves have gotten more intense. This is from Dana Habib's work in 2015, but has been subsequently kind of confirmed across many other contexts. These are for 50 cities in the United States. And as many of you also know, extreme heat remains at the top of the list of deadliest weather-related hazards. Depending on your definition of a weather-related death, though, this can be either first or second, or in somewhere in the top 5. But definitely, it's the thing that probably gets the least attention over the last few decades, with the more big-scale hurricanes and kind of charismatic large storms. Those sorts of things get much more attention relative to extreme heat. Now, that's not necessarily the case anymore. I think in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot more coverage of extreme heat waves and their role in creating morbidity and mortality. And it's no different here in Virginia. While we don't suffer a lot of direct cause deaths due to heat, other than small children that are left in cars, which is very tragic, we do see a very acute response in our morbidity. Now, this is the percentage of all visits to our health system, both emergency department and urgent care centers for heat-related illnesses, as defined by the CSTE, ICD-9 and 10 codes. And down here on the bottom is the temperature out at the airport here in Richmond, the apparent temperature, feels like temperature, heat island, or heat index, whatever you suits your fancy. As a function of those response, we see this kind of nonlinear response to increasing temperatures, in that more and more people get hot or get heat-related illnesses or appear in those contexts for heat-related illness as an increasing function of temperature. So some states in nearby North Carolina, we actually see like a reversal of this trend, where over 100 degrees Fahrenheit or so, there's actually a decrease in the total number of heat-related illness response. But here in Virginia, maybe we don't quite get the memo. But anyway, that's kind of what it looks like as a whole over the last, I guess this is 2014 to 2019 data. And in July 2019, more than 1,000 people sought emergency care for heat-related illness. So it's a very acute public health risk in Virginia, and one that's slowly gained a little bit more attention. Now, so that's kind of the background, like the climatological background. And, as heat waves become more intense due to human-caused climate change, there's this additional aspect of it that we need to spend a lot of time talking about. And this is really, we were having a lot of success connecting with our guests about the public health implications of climate change, but we were still having struggles communicating the impacts on our neighborhoods in Richmond. And so what we started doing was talking about urban heat islands. And some of the ways that we started doing that was through using a very low cost sensor to take pictures of our built environment around our campus. So here's a parking lot outside of the Science Museum of Virginia. You can see all these different types of building materials, from color to density to actually type of stone, and all different manner of landscaping, from non-native European grasses to this is a Bayscapes garden that's all native Virginia plants, and then big mature oak tree here. And then all manner of different types of cars and the colors. So when we take a picture of this using a thermal camera, what I usually like to do when I give this talk to a live audience is to have you make a hypothesis about where to find the coolest and warmest spot. So even though I can't hear your voice, think to yourself in your head where you would go and touch the warmest surface in this picture. And then think to yourself, all right, so where would I go to find the coolest surface? And by making those sorts of hypotheses and asking our guests to form those sorts of hypotheses, we can enter into a conversation about how the human fingerprint on our Earth system can be very acute on the same level as like a city block in our own city. So revealing the FLIR thermal image, unsurprisingly, the parking lot is by far the warmest surface. It's about 170 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas the coolest surface is underneath that mature oak tree, about 87 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, those are to the touch and do not necessarily reflect the overlying air temperature trends or magnitudes, but the more interesting stories are the things in between. I remember the non-native European grasses here that many people use for their lawns is about the same temperature as the sidewalk right adjacent to it. Whereas the native plants and low-lying native land cover, vegetative cover, is very much cooler to the touch because it's able to absorb and retain more stormwater and rainwater and keep that in the plants for longer. Versus those non-native grasses. Then very interestingly, in my opinion, all the different colors of the cars have a very significant impact on the surface temperature being emitted back into the environment. Then even that checkerboard pattern of the different density of building materials, you can see it play out very clearly as differential surface temperatures. And this white reflective bench stays cool no matter how hot it is outside. So, thinking about how a picture like this can serve as such an incredible teaching tool for a room full of people, that then we can say, like, all right, based on this picture, how would you and a lot of the times I like to ask the question, like, how would you design a city to minimize these surface temperatures versus amplifying them? And the hypothesis that's most audibly returned most of the time when I ask that question is, well, let's plant trees or use native plants or reflective surfaces. So it's a very clear teaching tool, and I'm very happy with that. But then the question becomes, well, do we already design our cities like that? And the answer, of course, is a resounding no, in that the urban heat island effect is something that's almost totally ubiquitous to the built environment. This image, derived from a colleague at NASA, Stephanie Utz, shows just how virtually every built environment attributable to people absorbs more of the sun's energy than the non-built environments and natural environments around it, and thereby augmenting the balance with that big ball of energy in the sky, the sun, and emits that shortwave radiation back into the air as heat throughout the afternoon into the evening. And so you can see the large urban archipelago from Norfolk here in Virginia here all the way up through Boston, places like Chicago, very highly and well-studied urban heat island effect there, and then places like Georgia, Atlanta, and kind of the I-5 corridor in the Northwest, and LA and those areas. So it's basically something that we can't, that we've built into our urban environments, regardless of how many people there. We can see these on the order of very small towns even. So of course we look at that most of the time from space using the Landsat satellite, very popular source of that information. Land surface temperatures derived from the thermal bands. And Landsat 8 is the most commonly used today for kind of present day conditions. But I like to compare some of the resolution of satellites to, I wear corrective lenses, and if I take my glasses off and I look at somebody's face, I can tell that they're a person and that they have eyes and a mouth and a nose and maybe some facial hair. But what I can't tell are the details that make it really clear who that person is. And maybe I can't see individual scars that might tell really important stories about a person's life. Those are the sorts of comparison of, like, satellites can't really see block specific heat islands that might tell really important stories about building community resilience. So air temperatures at the scale of less than 10 meters or 10 to 20 meters can still resolve these sorts of really highly detailed aspects of land surface temperatures and air temperatures that tell really important stories about building community resilience. So what I think, I hope that explains, is that there's a clear need for understanding these urban heat extremes within US cities. And then what I would implore is that we absolutely have to act on it, as the changing climate will only exacerbate exposure to these large-scale heat extremes in their duration, frequency, and intensity. So my main collaborator on this work, and certainly I came into it as a just a fan of what he was doing at Portland State University, but Vivek Chandas at Portland State, and now the principal of a spin-off organization called Kappa Strategies LLC. He had been figuring out how to use these really low cost sensors on what looked to be like the car flag of science. It's like a sports flag that you would hang out of your car, but instead of sports, we're adding science. And he has figured out how to mount them on cars and drive them around cities all over the world and get really highly detailed descriptions of heat across these urban environments. And a lot of our methods and results are documented in a paper that we published in January of 2019 in the MDPI journal Climate. So I invite you to go and see our results and description of the methods there. But in short, we put on these low-cost PVC pipe structures that you see here at the top. There's an aspirator head, a T-joint, that has a thermocouple sensor in it, sending signals down to a temperature data logger that's recording the temperature every single second. These are NIST standard, very, very highly precise, and do very well under a range of conditions and humidities. As well as, at the same time, a GPS unit is keeping track of where the car is in space every single second. So by sending several of these cars out in an urban environment at the same time, especially during an extreme heat event, we can gain a very clear and highly detailed description of heat across observation of heat in these areas. Then by pairing that information with something like LiDAR or Sentinel-2 thermal band, or Sentinel data at the city scale, we can achieve 10 meter or higher resolution using a predictive model to fill in the places where we didn't take observations with its relationship to the underlying land use as derived from the Sentinel-2 satellite. So to tell you a little bit about what that looks like in practice, here's kind of what we've done in Richmond. We formed in 2017. I basically cold called all of these people to say, hey, do you want to do science with me? And I'll start by describing, I reached out to the city of Richmond because they had an RVA meaning Richmond, Virginia, green being a sustainability plan. And with a time horizon of 2050, they were going through, well, how do we actually assess community vulnerability to a changing climate? And so Alicia Zakhoff, the sustainability director, and Brianne Mullen, the sustainability coordinator, were immediately agreeable to helping us plan and figure out how to maximize the usefulness of our study to their purpose, including their RVA Green 2050 plan, but also the Richmond 300 comprehensive master plan that was going to be kind of coming online at the same time. So they've been really instrumental in getting this information to the practitioners and the policy people at the city that are able to use it to look at things like relationships of the cooling centers and other sorts of assets that can be used during extreme heat, and incorporating that into their long-term resiliency plan. At the same time, I think the other equally important, but kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum, this nonprofit, environmental justice nonprofit called Groundwork RVA, which is part of a Groundwork USA network, was extremely important in getting us involved in the communities that might otherwise have been left out of a conversation like this. So the mission is to green Richmond, prepare their youth for success, improve the health and quality of life of everyone in Richmond, and realize racial equity. And so if there wasn't a group that was acting in a climate action kind of sense without even knowing it, this group was certainly that. And it was run by Giles Harnsberger and Kendra Norrell at the time, but now I get to work with Rob Jones and Melissa Guevara at Groundwork RVA now. And I just go to show these two slides to show you that in the city of Richmond and in many other cities around the US, the climate science adaptation and resilience world is really being run by really amazing women and people of color, which I think is really important to realize and to comment on, because they're absolutely instrumental to what's been going on in the city of Richmond and elsewhere. So anyway, in July 2017, we dispatched the Portland State University assets around the city. This is Ajana James, who was a sophomore at Open High School at the time of the campaign, but now has graduated and is now majoring in environmental science, which is really awesome. I think she's one of like the star students from this group. She's affixing that car flag of science to the vehicle that drove around on the south side of Richmond. It was a 99th percentile heat day in the city of Richmond. It was absolutely unbelievably warm out, and so we hit a really good day to measure the city's urban heat island effect, as well as it was the day that had the highest number of heat-related illnesses reported in the city of Richmond and throughout the state of Virginia. So we really were given a good opportunity to measure the potential amplitude of these differences among parts of the city. And just to give you a feel for kind of the group that we had both adults and children. Well, not really children, but teenagers, folks out at the University of Richmond. This is the University of Richmond team, and the team that we met up at the Six-Pick building, which is Groundwork RVA's headquarters. We also had a doctor that worked for our local health department, Bon Secours Health System. She works with the uninsured network in Richmond called the Caravan, and so she's been really instrumental in getting these data out to the groups that are disproportionately impacted by heat, as you'll see in a second. And then we had university partners and nonprofit partners as well. So it was a really, really good. We had about 40 volunteers overall, and so the results were very striking. We identified a 16-degree difference between the coolest and warmest place at the exact same time during that heat wave. Here I'm just presenting them in bins, so you can kind of see the magnitude between different areas of the city. And so the kind of keep in mind this like dog leg or boomerang kind of shape in the city of Richmond here. And in the resilience world, a lot of times or in the vulnerability assessment world, we refer to this kind of a thing as the exposure to heat waves, and that some people are obviously disproportionately exposed to warmer temperatures at the same time during a heat wave. Now, so looking at some other things, we started to work with our community partners in a vulnerability assessment, and they very quickly latched onto the idea of a tree canopy as a main predictor of those temperatures. And in fact, our method, while it doesn't directly incorporate tree canopy as a measure, the Sentinel-2 band, I forget which band exactly it was, that's highly correlated with like NDVI, but that's a major predictor of where temperatures are either cooler or warmer, depending on the availability of that tree canopy. So you can see that same kind of boomerang shape in tree canopy, but also in the built environment. This is kind of the opposite of that tree canopy map. And probably unsurprisingly for anybody that's familiar with the National Land Cover Database, I haven't updated these maps with the new 2016 data, but that'll be going on. And I've averaged these into the census block groups because one of the things that also our community partners felt was very important was the idea of adaptive capacity, or what they said, the ability for people to kind of deal with the heat. And so this is represented by urban poverty. And I call this map the color of money map because you can really see the darker green areas are not only darker green in their availability of wealth, but also trees. This has been an observation for many years in kind of social science and urban planning literature, that wealth and trees are correlated heavily in a lot of cities in the US. And so many of the places that were hottest have this very low adaptive capacity in the sense of just urban poverty. And by feature scaling these 4 variables, it's very simple treatment that puts things from 0 to 1. And basically then anything you could think of like low trees being kind of like the worst of the 2 conditions, we kind of standardize everything from like 0 to 1 being from the best to the worst condition, so that 4 would be this perfectly vulnerable area and 0 would be a perfectly invulnerable area, which is impossible given the data values. But you can see the difference in vulnerability across the city based on those 4 variables. Darker red means higher vulnerability. And we don't talk about it here like anybody's invulnerable. Everybody can suffer a heat-related illness. Every single heat-related illness is preventable. So we rank things from lowest to highest. And we actually worked with our Richmond Ambulance Authority to then kind of check our answer. And so we asked the Ambulance Authority to look at where were, over the last 5 years, where did you go to the most for a heat-related illness? And so the map of the heat-related illness responses is on the right here. And so maybe unsurprisingly to a lot of people that work on heat vulnerability and then the corresponding heat-related illness data, this isn't surprising, but for an education campaign, this is very striking, and people find this to be very compelling information. Even when we correct for the population density in these areas, that this relationship still exists. We can't disaggregate any further than zip code, but that remains the same pattern. The 4 hottest zip codes have the 4 highest rates of ambulance responses as well as urgent care center visits. So there seems to be a real deal effect of the urban heat island effect, as well as the underlying vulnerability of the population in the resulting health records. So just lay them on top of each other for you one more time to drive the point home. But we think this is really decision relevant science. And so we've enjoyed a lot of positive press and involvement around the city around these data. Many groups are using it to like decide where to plant trees and where to green up vacant lots, where to put in community gardens. It's really, really astounding to watch, in your own city. But we've also been fortunately supported by the Climate Program Office at NOAA's. At NOAA, and David Herring has been instrumental in supporting us going to places like Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, Maryland, and Boston, Massachusetts, which is one of the cities of, I think, 9 cities that performed these sorts of campaigns in the summer of 2019. We went to Baltimore and D.C. in 2018. And I'll tell you a little bit about the impacts in those places that we've started to see unfold over the last even just the past couple of months in Boston, but the last year or so in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. You can already see the kind of group that we had involved in Baltimore. We were hosted by the National Aquarium. In Washington, D.C., we had support from the Smithsonian and the Department of Energy and Environment at the City of D.C.'s Climate Ready D.C. program. And I got to drive through the National Mall, which was really, really cool, to drive past the Washington Monument with a scientific implement hanging out of your car is pretty cool. And this picture was actually taken by Jacob Fenston, who reports out of WAMU in the DC region. So, and the Museum of Science Boston hosted the campaign in Boston. And I think it's really, really important that educational institutions like the Science Museum of Virginia or the Museum of Science in Boston are those kind of trusted local sources of science information to serve as that nexus point for all of these groups to come in and not only learn about the urban heat island effect, but then to go out and assess it and then continue to do the engagement afterwards. But one of the groups that we worked with in Baltimore was the Baltimore Tree Trust, and they have been working really hard getting ongoing coverage from Scott Dance at this Baltimore Sun, who covered our campaign both before and after it, including the results. And then the Baltimore Tree Trust has continually on their Instagram provided these really cool and simple graphics that they can communicate with their Instagram followers, talking about how tree canopy coverage lessens this potential health disparity. And so they now use these data to help prioritize their tree plantings in East Baltimore. And it's a really cool one-to-one, they participated in the campaign and then now use that information to help further their mission to build climate resilience in Baltimore in an equitable sense as well. On the a little bit south of there in DC, I had the fortunate opportunity to work with Kate Johnson at the Department of Energy and Environment on continuing to use these data, and the American Institute of Architects, or I think that's what the AIA stands for. It's some architectural group. We're hosting a Climate Ready DC kind of event called Designing for Extremes, Building a Resilient City. And she was tweeting about Capital Weather Gang, who had reported on the outcomes of our urban heat island study, both before and after our campaign. And so I saw that she had posted this, and I tweeted back to her saying, "Are y'all going to use the heat island map?" Both of them then liked my tweet, and Kate responded, "Well, we'll have to flip over who gets to use it in their slides." It turns out that they didn't actually have to flip, because they both used it in their slides, and it really reinforces the fact that the Capital Weather Gang and meteorology kind of group plus a planning department can be talking about the same data and how it intersects in their interests. And the Washington DC map was featured in the National Geographic magazine in August 2019, which is really amazing. This really effective presentation of the data shows just how wide of a range we saw. So the hottest temperatures were somewhere around Columbia Heights, about 102, down to about 85.5 degrees somewhere in Rock Creek Park. So from that same kind of thing that you saw in the picture from the parking lot here at the Science Museum, it's those really wide streets versus the very shady trees. And we were really, really fortunate to have this featured in National Geographic, but they also use it now in a lot of their public presentations about it. So here again is Kate Johnson in the white jacket, and next to her is Kristen Baja from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, talking about Climate Ready DC and how to increase equity in the face of a changing climate and building resilience. And you can see there's that map, which is really great. And I hear that people tell a lot of jokes about there being some hot air over Capitol Hill, but I was part of that measurement campaign, so I can definitely say that that's at least partially true. In the city of Boston, this has been really fun to watch go on, because they had in a classically Boston sense, the Museum of Science hosted this program called Wicked Hot Boston. You have to add wicked to something to attract volunteers, maybe, I don't know, but it was a really, really inventive way to advertise their community science program. And so throughout July and August, they had over 50 volunteers measure temperatures around 10 different neighborhoods in Boston, Brookline, and Cambridge. And so the results of their campaign are really, really exciting, because Kappa Strategies and Vivek Chandas's group has figured out how to also include a humidity sensor, allowing them to not only report the air temperature, but also the heat index. And you can see here from 3 to 4 p.m. in the afternoon in Boston, temperatures were somewhere between 187 minimum and 102 maximum in just the air temperature. But the heat index varied by almost 19 degrees Fahrenheit, which is just amazing to see. And some of the details in this map are hard to pull out, but some really interesting things like the downtown part of Boston. This is the 3 to 4 p.m. That downtown Boston, creating these urban canyons that actually create shade and very tree-lined areas of major roadways are areas that are cooler and big, large exposed travel lanes and stuff are very hot. So same kind of patterns that we see in other cities. And this is really exciting new data from the Campus Strategies group. But what I think was really exciting about what the Museum of Science did was they added in this science to civics program afterwards. So they invited all of their citizen scientists, so their community-based participatory research program volunteers, to join in a 3-hour event at the Science Museum. Now, they play this kind of tabletop game where they take on the roles of several people in their town or in that municipality. And in this case, it's called Heat Town, which it doesn't actually relate back to Boston directly. It's actually loosely based off of Louisville, Kentucky. And so they invite their volunteers, but they also invite civic leaders and people from the regional government, and as well as practitioners from other sorts of groups like the Department of Health. And they all go through this this exercise together about how to use their resources in the most effective way. So you see these two blue chips, or these blue chips on this map down here. They've chosen these 2 resilient strategies. So they are presented with 3 different heat resilient strategies. And then what they do is they actually have Esri story maps that then show them the impacts of their decisions. I think this is extremely powerful because they get to deliberate at these tables about what to do given this information about these urban heat islands. So far, this hasn't yet yielded a measurable action yet in the city of Boston, but I think they're poised to make a really big impact based on this sort of program. And we're hoping that this is incorporated into future campaigns. This is also co-sponsored by the Arizona State University group that does these science and technology deliberative events. But to bring it back to Richmond, I want to tell you about what we've been doing. So now we've been empowering teenagers to take action on the urban heat island effect using what we're calling throwing shade in RVA. And so the students are led through the climate program office's steps to resilience. They explore the heat island effect in both the model and the real world. We go outside and take thermal photos again out in the real world. They do design strategies for ameliorating heat. We give them little mini grants to install green infrastructure mitigation strategies on these doll houses, or these ready row homes that were designed by the Franklin Institute. And then you can see down here, we actually get to teach them about stormwater, which is a key co-benefit of addressing extreme heat in urban areas. You get benefits from absorbing that stormwater too. And as we know, the urban heat island effect doesn't just affect heat, it also affects storms themselves. So they can actually artificially or kind of spur precipitation events as well. So we get to kind of have these co-benefits. Then the students go out and actually do a solution. So in this case, they built a shade structure that they've been putting around at various bus stops. The previous group planted fruit trees at their local high school. So it's all based on what the students themselves decide they want to do. And it's a really cool way to see them go through a transformation. Because then when we evaluate them for their learning outcomes, on the left here are the words that they use to describe the urban heat island effect before the throwing shade program, and the words that they use to describe the urban heat island effect after the throwing shade program. There's a 60% increase in the syllabic content of their words and a 128% increase in the unique words used. So we see that their vocabulary has actually expanded, allowing each of the students to kind of grasp on to whatever they thought was the most important thing that they learned. So you see things about industrialization, you see things about health, you see things about the physics. So whatever these students found to be the most interesting part, they took home with them on the long term. And I think that that's a really powerful outcome of this work. So we give ourselves a little gold star in this one highest vulnerability neighborhood in the northeast part of Richmond. There's a lot of work left to do, including here on our own campus. This is the Science Museum of Virginia's urban campus. We're surrounded by impervious surfaces, as you can see here. The Science Museum here has this blue dome. We're in a former train station called Broad Street Station, designed by John Russell Pope. And we have this giant parking lot in the front that we're going to replace with a smaller parking deck in between us and our neighbors at the Children's Museum of Richmond. And so once we complete this parking deck, we are going to completely rip up that parking lot and turn it into a best management practice for stormwater, heat, and air quality park, a civic green space. It'll be the only civic green space directly off of our best and most frequent transit line called the BRT Pulse, Bus Rapid Transit. And it'll make use of all native plants, as well as have areas for public art and meeting spaces and kind of placemaking opportunities with seating, and definitely restrict the urban heat island effect along at least this tree-lined LA in these small little corner of Richmond's urban heat island that we inhabit. And so I want to kind of just bring it to, doesn't stop there. We've also been funded by the I Thrive grant. It's an outgrowth of the National Institutes of Health, to investigate not only like how do these environmental conditions shift between these contexts, but how does the experience change people's physiology. I've been working with Jenny Rowe at the University of Virginia and a colleague at Virginia Tech on how to assess people's kind of well-being on these walk-arounds in different parts of the city. We've also now been funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services to get really high quality air quality sensors, mobile air quality sensors, to include on these walkabouts, to really understand how people walking through a design that looks kind of like this, car dominated, very low canopy, changes and how their bodies and their physiology changes under these contexts on the right. So this shady, kind of pedestrian friendly, very low traffic kinds of green infrastructure laden neighborhoods in the city of Richmond. Because I truly think that it is the design of these spaces in the urban environment that will have huge impacts on our community resilience. And by including people that live in those neighborhoods in the process, you achieve much greater impacts and long-lasting climate resilience action. So with that, I think I'll hand it back over to Lad. But first, I'll say, please reach out to me if you have questions or you're interested in potentially performing one of these campaigns. I've linked here the Kappa Strategies LLC website, which I am not directly affiliated with, just to make sure that you know there's no conflict of interest. I just like to see what they're doing and be involved if I can. And I think the Kappa Heat Watch program will continue to grow. There are already dozens of cities that are interested in doing it in 2020. I can't wait to see where it goes next. So thanks so much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Jeremy. And again, if you have any questions, please do type those into the Zoom group chat, and I'll make sure to relay those. One question we have is, Jeremy, could you discuss how the heat mapping strategy from the car differs from a satellite-derived urban heat island map, and maybe some of the pros and cons between those two kind of different ways to display the urban heat island?
Yeah, sure. So, first and foremost, kind of originally, or at the start of my talk, we talked a little bit about the resolution. So, the biggest difference here is in their underlying ability to see higher, or either a coarser or a more detailed description of how heat varies across an urban environment. Many of the satellites that we used are subsampled down to 30 meter resolution, which is, still quite large part of our large area in a city. Now and furthermore, they're only seeing the land surface temperature, which is the kind of feels like temperature. If you were to put your hand on that surface, what temperature would you feel? Which can be misleading in that it's not necessarily directly related to the experiential temperature that someone walking around in that environment might feel. So you think about like an average person, average American, like 5'6", 5'7", or up to like 6 feet, 2 meter air temperatures, while correlated, are not necessarily exactly what you see from a satellite, or what are experiential temperatures, meaning that in like a downtown area, a lot of the temperatures that might be coming back from are coming up to the satellite are really the rooftops of the buildings that are in that downtown area, or if you don't have very wide streets versus how tall the buildings can be, it can be very misleading because those buildings are actually probably shading where people are walking at the 6 foot height. So what these maps, what the Kappa Heat Watch program produces, are very highly detailed descriptions of heat at a scale of 10 meters or better. Right now, I know they're working with the Sentinel satellite to kind of make it's a machine learning algorithm that uses random forest regression to maximize the kind of like, it's a model of where the heat is. So basically, you can think of it as like every measurement that we get, those 1 second by 1 second temperature measurements, is then related to the underlying land use from the Sentinel-2 satellite. And then we basically get a predictive model to infill where we don't have observations across the same domain. A lot of the times the R-squared values for these maps are on the order of 0.97, 0.98, 0.99. So we have very high confidence that what we're seeing in the model, and it's been, cross-validated by leaving like 30% of the data out at a time, that we see patterns that are really related to the experience of people. So in a nutshell, satellites see a much coarser description of heat, and in some places where we're really interested in people's experiential temperatures, the land surface temperature maps derived from satellites can be very different from what people actually experience. So these maps that the Kappa Strategies group and the Portland State group before them produced are more descriptive in many ways of the human experience of temperature than the land surface temperature satellite derived maps.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. And I think one final question. I was just wondering, since you had talked through some of your observations of teaching the public about extreme heat in the urban heat island, and you had mentioned kind of the use of the imagery and kind of having people test out their hypotheses before you show them the floor image. Do you have any other best practices that you could share with the practitioners that are watching the webinar, just kind of getting the message out about extreme heat? What else have you seen that's worked really well?
Yeah, so definitely, I think the idea that it's one of the most, or if not the most deadly weather-related hazard is a great way to start talking about it. That it's a kind of a silent killer, and a lot of the times it's areas of the city that are resource, or areas of our communities that are resource limited, are very good kind of starter conversations. Then also, I think if you don't have this FLIR camera, other ways that I've seen kind of these descriptions of how the human environment amplifies heat is to just buy a very cheap infrared thermometer. A lot of the times they almost look like kind of handheld, like almost like a gun kind of thing, like a laser gun. And you can just walk outside during a hot day, even on a relatively cool day, and you'll be able to see the large temperature differences between these different surfaces. So when we have like an interview with news casters or journalists, and we go outside and actually share with them the measurements that we're taking, and they see that, like, man, the sidewalk or the asphalt's 170 degrees, and then under this tree it's a really good way, and under the tree it's 100 degrees less than that. It's a very, very compelling way to talk about how the human built environment can have huge impacts on our experience. And so that's a great way to talk about the urban heat island effect. I do also think that it's important to mention again that, or to even if maybe I didn't mention it, that it's really important to talk about climate change as this background stressor that's making heat waves worse for everyone, but that the urban heat island effect acutely amplifies that background stressor. So you separate that these urban heat islands would exist even without background climate change. I mean, they were discovered in the 1800s, before human warming was very substantial. So climate change is in effect a reason to want to address the urban heat island effect in a more rapid fashion. So just keeping it straight that like climate change is this very serious thing that's increasing the duration, frequency, and intensity of heat waves, as well as these other things like precipitation and air quality potentially, and those sorts of things, and allergies. And then we have on top of that our city that further amplifies those background changes. I think is really a best practice to make sure that you're not confusing people about the drivers of climate change, which is very squarely human emissions of heat trapping gases, and then the urban heat island effect, which is dominantly due to the underlying form and design of an urban area.
Great. Well, thank you again, Jeremy, for joining us on this webinar. I think you've shared a lot of your experiences and it's been really helpful. If you could go to the last slide really quickly and then we'll wrap it up.
Oh, yes, right. There we go.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so just again, for everyone on the webinar, just for future webinars and updates, make sure to go to heat.arizona.edu. And we do have all of our past webinars posted. You can access them through that website, and they're all on the YouTube channel for this network. And then if you have any questions or if you want to be subscribed to the list for future updates, make sure to email me at lad@arizona.edu. So thanks again for joining us, and thanks again, Jeremy, for the great presentation today.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks.